Hi all, I have an amazing game to show you from round 3 of the Gashimov Memorial. Wesley So was playing white against Michael Adams. So the top British player, Michael Adams. In their last few encounters, I believe it was just 3 draws between them. So perhaps the expectation was for black to play solidly and get a draw. But let's see what happened. D4 from Wesley. Michael Adams played knight f6. After c4 we have e6, as though wanting perhaps a Nimzo engine or a Queen's engine. In fact, after knight c3, Michael Adams didn't pin the knight, he didn't go into the Nimzo engine. Instead, d5, another solid move of course, and Wesley took on d5 after e takes d5. Yes, it releases this bishop, but this bishop is often not that aggressive, it's not doing too much. Black has this commitment to look after the d5 pawn. Bishop g5 was played, and black actually protects more the d5 pawn. Another popular move here is to play bishop e7 as well. So c6, so slightly rare move order here. e3, and now usually bishop e7 now, actually that's the most common move by far. Knight bd7 is another move. Michael Adams actually plays h6, which is a reasonable move as well. It would be nice perhaps to get the queen to f6 immediately and the bishop say here. That would be quite aggressive improvement. But the bishop just drops back. Bishop e7. Bishop d3. So very logical looking. Knight bd7. And now here is a little bit of a surprise. Usually queen c2 is played, 90 games in line, but with that knight f3 is another popular one, about 30, or knight here. But instead we see a very early f3. So this is quite committal, because with f3 you'd think the follow-up would generally be e4 in general. And this kind of plan was popularized by Mikhail Botvinnik, this expansion in the center, often leading to great attacking positions. But there is a kind of instability of white's center as well, which can sometimes be exploited. So it's not always a one-way street, of course. Black now cannot also rely on knight e4s to exchange off the bishop. Sometimes knight f e4 would be a simplification maneuver. For example, without f3, say like this, knight e4 might be possible here to get the bishops exchanged. And it reminds me of the Capablanca famous simplifying maneuver, which Capablanca used in quite a lot of games to just fairly easily equalize, get rid of the tension in position, get rid of the pieces, basically simplify down. So it's a sort of tension maintainer, because the bishop being able to drop back is a very interesting idea, and it's very early. This is kind of novelty move at the high level. Move 9 to play f3. So black castles. We see queen c2, so that nice battery, of course, classic battery on the diagonal. And now black plays b5, so perhaps inspired by f3. This is a few things about this. If white quickly castles queenside here, then maybe queen a5 and b4 would be the welcoming party. But also the b5 pawn supports knight b6 to c4, so it's got a few purposes. And in fact, white doesn't commit to castling queenside. That might be a bit risky. Knight g e2 was played. Within this structure, though, with b5 being played, with this structure, the c5 square is often useful for white to try and maneuver a knight to. And here, actually, this is, for example, such a knight maneuver. Knight b6, and black is going into this square, of course, as well. So these two squares are very interesting strategically right now. a3, trying to discourage any b4s from black. a5. Now, white really doesn't want to castle queenside with this imminent b4, so he actually castles kingside. Bishop d7. So for the moment, it looks like a fairly solid position for both sides, but there is a slight Achilles heel here and here for both sides to probe. Knight c1, so this knight reflects this knight, it's going into c5, whilst this one can go into c4 at some point. And in fact, knight c4 now. So what to do about e3? White really doesn't want to take on c4 here, giving up his nice light square bishop. You can imagine, you know, later black maybe taking over this diagonal even. So rook e1, just protecting e3, and the bishop goes to e6 now, perhaps in advance of any e4. That d5 is more supported here, but white doesn't want to play e4 in this position. Obviously, actually, if we look at this, there's a big problem with d4 takes. Whoops! So we can't actually play e4 in this position in any case. So it's against e4 really. Bishop e6. Got pressure on d4 there. So knight b3 was played, and now black actually is concerned about c5 perhaps, and maybe wants an exchange of bishops. Knight d7, looking at this bishop for an exchange. But here we see the beauty of f3. The bishop can retreat. So white's whole opening seems to be so far designed against any simplification. He's got this energy that's being built up in the center, but will e4 be the thematic move to kind of liberate the pieces? Let's see. Rook c8, rook ad1. So the rooks are nicely centralized. Everything seems ready now, or readier for e4. In fact, in this position, after rook c8, e4 was also interesting to consider, but maybe black has a4 here, which is annoying. For example, like this, knight going back, taking on d2, knight b6, and yeah, black seems to be fairly solid here. I'm not sure what e4 has actually achieved concretely. So in fact, playing e4 is not mandatory, and it's not played actually after rook c8, just rook ad1. Okay, so queen c7 now, and here we see a waiting move, actually, a kind of waiting move, h3. Maybe, for example, if e4 is played in the future, g4 would be a concern for a knight coming to g4. So it could be an advance, you could argue, of e4. But it does slightly weaken the dark squares, of course, playing a move like h3. This g3 square in particular has been weakened now by both the pawns being here. We see rook fd8, and here is the time where white's position seems fairly optimal, in fact, to play e4. And it's interesting, it still wasn't played in this position. e4 is still not played. If we look at e4 here, I think black with a4 is disrupting things. This knight is not perhaps ideally placed if it's not really going to c5. So for example, knight going back, knight takes, queen takes, black could play d takes here, for example bishop b3, and that's a nuisance. For example, this position doesn't really seem bad at all for black. In fact, the c4 square is a lovely square for the knight here, and white's lost his light square bishop. Doesn't seem a big deal at all actually, this position, so black would seem okay there. So it's interesting that here white actually plays something different with this structure. You might think this is a bit awkward, this bishop actually, if e4 isn't going to be played, and this move looks a bit stonewally, but white played f4. Positionally it seems a bit maybe weird to have this bishop behind the pawns like this, but it is adding a bit of solidity to the dark squares generally there. And of course there's the concrete idea of f5 to trap the bishop. So overall it would seem to actually keep more tension going in the position, and the pieces are kept on longer, it seems, with f4. So how should black react? Well, black actually played a4 here, and in fact this was ignored. White just plays f5, and what we get is a transaction here, a very important transaction from white's perspective. White gains the light square bishop in effect here, which of course means black could be vulnerable on the light squares. We have a takes b3, queen takes, and the bishop remains trapped. Perhaps, and this is where black could perhaps improve on the game here a bit, Michael Adams took on f5, giving up the light square bishop, and this position seems to be very interesting, even more interesting for e4 now, because of white's extra light square pressure and the bishop pair generally working together. interesting to consider here, technically, is if black tried to revisit this g3 square with bishop d6. So for example like this position here, bishop g3, this is a kind of scenario where perhaps black could gain some sort of dark square counterattack. It's an engine variation here. Queen takes g3, e4, and there's threats like bishop takes here to either queen at some point as well. But it seems, you know, black has some incredible resources in this type of position. If he could have got his queen here, there's an incredible resource here for black. Knight d e5, trying to go into f3. So for example like this position, this is actually an interesting way to play for black on the dark squares, where black has good compensation and in fact is doing very well. Even though a piece down, black has a strong initiative. So it seems that g3 square could have been resourcefully used in theory with very, very precise moves. But in fact, we see Michael Adams playing this move, which means actually e4 is a little bit stronger now than before. Now here, sidestepping the rook, actually, queen c2, b4. Although b2 seems a viable target here, bishop takes b4. We have rook e2. And here again, it seems perhaps that black should consider trying to use this g3 square, if not to make the king or sacrifice a piece, just positioning to keep things under control, to make sure this bishop is not going to cause any damage in the future. Try and weaken white's dark squares. It seems here bishop d6 might have been a good idea. For example, well, there's a threat also on b2, so white attends to b2, for example, check, and then bishop g3, and it's hard to say that black is really that much worse here. It seems things are fairly under control. So I think there was a theoretical downside of h3, and some examples express that actually it could have been in some way exploited perhaps by black. But instead we see this move queen a5, and the queen's away from the king here. The king's actually not got too many pieces around it. And we see bishop h4 now. These bishops are lurking around. And it causes a weakness now. Obviously not knight f6, we could just snap that off. If the rook moves, then bishop takes. So we have this horrible weakness f6 created, which immediately, of course, once f6, it immediately weakens this diagonal, which means actually the light square bishop is going to have a greater time. It also means e4 has more effect to it. But for the moment, white handles the situation on the queen side with knight a4, knight f8. Now the bishop drops back, bishop d3, hitting the knight. One moment also, in this position, before knight a4 was played, there was also an interesting tactical possibility, by the way, of knight e4. This is also quite dangerous for black, with some tactical ideas. For example, knight f8 taking here would be dangerous. This sort of position. But yeah, knight a4 was played by Wesley. Also, you know, if king h8 taking here, this is a kind of vicious attack for wrestling mate. Very, very vicious kind of consequences. So it seems, yeah, knight e4 technically would have been an interesting move here. But yeah, knight a4 is good as well. Knight f8, bishop d3. The knight goes back. Now knight c3, and again now e4 is really ripe here, starting to be extremely ripe to play. c5, white takes this, bishop takes, a temporary inconvenience on e4. The king unpins, so e4 is ready to go now, you'd think. Rook bc8, but one more little finesse, bishop f5 hitting the rook. Rook c6. Now finally, here it is at move 34, but it's under much more favourable circumstances than ever before in the game. It seems there are multiple instances before where black was simply simplifying and having still a very solid position, and even leaving white with light square weaknesses without the light square bishop. Here, it's a very different scenario. White has the light square bishop, black doesn't. e4 has a huge impact to it here. Not only that, the subsequent e5 is actually supporting the pin on f6 here with that bishop on h4. You might think, is this like a loose piece, by the way? There's a loose piece in the position, but it's very difficult to exploit it. I don't think there's any real tricks here to exploit that. d5 is a concern. So we see actually bishop b4 putting pressure on c3, and then e5. Black is on the defensive. Bishop e7, queen b3. Now with queen b3 there's all sorts of issues. Pressure on d5. e4 can be used perhaps. So black now is in a very difficult position, and perhaps best would have been to sidestep the pin like white did with king h8. This position is still quite good for white though. White could gang up, for example, on d5 like this. Alternatively, white can actually even encourage an exchange of queens to get a small but clear advantage like this with a nice blockade on d4, and horrible consequences could result there as well. So that's not a very nice position for black. In this position, black played quite a dubious move, queen c5, which basically results in terrible damage to king safety. White took on f6 here after bishop takes. Now a very powerful logical move. Can you spot it? If I give you 5 seconds, what does white play here? Okay, knight e4, exploiting the pin, and it's horrible to win that dark square bishop. So white's basically got both bishops now and damaged black's pawn structure. Look at black's pawn structure, it's a wreck. The bishop pair against the two knights, but there's also technically queen g3 check now. Extremely horrible position to be in. If the rook joins in with rook e7, then that's end of game, basically. So the king goes to f7 trying to defend itself, but rook d e1 simply renewing rook e7 as a threat of checkmate actually now. Queen b4, the queen is prepared to give herself up for two rooks, but this is no good. Rook e7 anyway, the queen gives herself up. Queen g7 is just too strong here. This is far too strong. If the king comes out, then something like queen takes f6 looks pretty devastating here. We've got this battery on d8 to win d8 if nothing else. So yeah, the king actually goes to e8, and now with the queen cutting off the king, basically there's a simple and decisive move here which finishes the game. Can you spot it? If I give you 5 seconds starting from now. Okay, bishop g4 with the bishop coming to h5. It spells the end of the game really. Black is defenseless here. Black resigned. So Wesley So put on 2.5 out of 3. What a bounce back from his previous controversies from the US Championship, which he described as one of the worst tournaments ever he had. He's really bounced back in this amazingly strong tournament, the Gashimov Memorial. It was a fantastic game. Some interesting ideas. The early f3. It kept a lot of the tension and the pieces on in the position, and it seemed, at various points e4 might be tempting, but perhaps Wesley So chose the most practical, aggressive choice to play for f4 instead. He grabbed that bishop pair. Only when he had the bishop pair did he play for e4, and it seems a lot more powerful and effective, especially with e5 to follow with the bishop on h4. And then black fell down completely with queen c5, losing the dark square bishop, losing the pawn structure, losing king safety, and white just crashes through at the end. A very crushing game in many respects. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.